Talk Zone presents the Geek Speak Radio Show with your hosts, Henry and Romo. Your top spot for everything entertainment and pop culture, including TV, movies, comics, casting news, and more. Now, here are your hosts, Henry and Romo.
Hi, everybody. Here we are. Welcome to the Geek Speak Radio Show. He's actually connected, not family-wise, but he actually came from, we talked to Ken Denby, the Geek Dad, last week. And on his website, he had a link to this book. So, Ethan, welcome to the Geek Speak Radio Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for you. Come on. First of all, before we get into the book, let's get into you. Let's get to know you. Tell us a bit about your childhood and your geek upbringing.
Sure. It's actually a really good question, and certainly, when I was going around the country last fall when the book came out in hardcover, now that it's out in paperback, just a few days ago, and doing events for the book as well, people are curious about sort of my geek cred, like where do I come from and what my take is going to be on all these various fantasy and gaming subcultures. So I come at to the subject as a kind of reformed Dungeons and Dragons addict or player. I played a ton of D&D back in the Reagan administration is the best way to put it. Some years ago, read a ton of science fiction and fantasy, and have been peripherally involved in keeping tabs on the various gaming and fantasy subcultures all through my adulthood. But the journey of the book that I describe is really how I kind of turned away from my geekdom and realized that it was actually still very much a part of me. And so as a 40-year-old, many years later, I rediscovered all of my old Dungeons and Dragons paraphernalia in the basement of my parents' house, and that with the simultaneous, maybe auspicious planet aligning a moment of also having the Lord of the Rings movies come out, which I got immediately sucked into and enjoyed tremendously. Those two events kind of spurred in me a kind of a soul-searching quest to find out, how gaming and fantasy had shaped me as a kid, and really how things had changed in the interim 25 years. And of course, things have changed a lot, which I'm sure we'll be able to talk about.
Right. Actually, myself, right around the Reagan administration era, also, I got into D&D. Tell you the truth, I really didn't get in. I played it a couple times. It wasn't my thing. A couple of years later, or 3 years later after D&D, the Star Trek role-playing game, which is similar, used the same rules and everything, came out, and I really got into that one.
Yep.
So I do know about the role-playing games also.
What's wonderful about them is they, if you're not into the sort of fantasy swords and sorcery realm, if that doesn't, turn you on or speak to your imagination, since the 1980s, there've been a whole number of permutations. Just about every fandom universe has got some role-playing game associated with it, whether it's an old school, role-playing game that's like D&D with a sort of pencil and paper and maps and dice and that kind of thing, or whether it's a online or video game.
Right. Myself, I use that game to, as well as reading books and everything else, to stay away from the other kids, because I knew from an early age that I was a geek, I was a nerd. I liked it, I embraced it, but I used the game as an escape. Something happened in your life also, and did you use this game as an escape? So tell us what that is, and if you use the game as an escape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think as a teenager, as a 12-year-old kid growing up in a small town in New Hampshire, I really was quite aware of what role D&D was playing for me. But it just so happened that coincidentally, around the time that I discovered D&D, which is to say that my next-door neighbor across the street from me, who showed up one summer, he was a new kid in the neighborhood, introduced me to the game. It coincided with a very important year of my life, which is the year that my mother suffered a brain aneurysm, a ruptured brain aneurysm, and she was in the hospital in Boston for several months. She came out of it. She survived it, but she was greatly changed. She was disabled, had various physical, emotional, and mental, impairments, and to a certain extent was just a real, scary presence in some ways in my life as a kid who was trying to come to terms with my mother who had changed so much. So,
right.
Whether there was some guardian angel looking over me and somehow, noticed that here was a kid who was maybe headed for some trouble and was going to have a hard time coping with this and happened to make sure that I was introduced to Dungeons & Dragons or not. I don't know. Maybe I would have discovered it in another way, but I really think that D&D saved me, in high school, all through my adolescence. It really gave me a place to channel my energies and to, exert some control, I think, over my world, even though it was a fantasy world, because the real world was sort of spinning out of control for me to a certain extent. And the other thing that's important, I think, to remember is that for many kids like myself, who was not on the sort of athlete track, I wasn't going to be on any sporting teams of my high school. I wasn't a super popular kid. I didn't have very many social skills. I was pretty shy. Didn't have a girlfriend, and go to all the parties and that kind of thing that many of the quote unquote popular kids in my school were. So kids who are like that, which is I think I've discovered increasingly, like 90% of the people out there in the world, they need something else to do, that's going to give them a sense of purpose and camaraderie and kind of shared interest. And for some people it's football, and for some people it's horseback riding, and for some people it's Boy Scouts, and for me it was Dungeons and Dragons. So I definitely got my varsity letter in D&D by the time I graduated high school.
Yeah, a few weeks ago we had on an author who wrote a book on gaming addiction. It specifically was video gaming addiction. Now, a lot of people say the same thing about the role-playing games. Would you agree? Or because I agree with what you just said right now, is that it is a healthy outlet. I'll put it that way. Because I use it, like I said, I use it for the same thing. So you think it's a healthy outlet for kids?
This is a book, Unplugged, by Ryan Van Cleve. Is that the guy you have in the show?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's someone I've been in touch with. I think it's an absolutely healthy outlet, and I just think that, and this was on my mind again because once again I was just writing a little blog post or opinion piece about this. There once again have been some stories in the news about people who've done deviant, quote unquote deviant things. A very horrible story about a guy who murdered a young woman, and the reporter thought it was important to mention that he also was a D&D player, as if somehow someone who played D&D, was automatically some kind of social freak. And this has always been the case with Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. And before that, other kinds of popular culture fads or phenomenons that are new and people don't understand them. And they think that it's going to corrupt the minds of America's youth. And this happened with comic books, and it happened with horror movies, and it happened with heavy metal music and rap music and on and on. And the thing to remember is just it's all a matter of balance and a matter of restraint. I mean, anyone who does anything to the exclusion of everything else, they only do one thing. Let's say they follow their sports team, or they hang out in their basement, with their model trains. I mean, if they do that all to the detriment of maintaining relationships with their family and their children and their jobs and everything else, then there's definitely a problem, and it can be, quote unquote, taken too far. But it's a little bit unfair to single out gaming, and saying it's particularly dangerous. That said, maybe there is an argument to be made, and I talk about this in my book a little bit, that because particularly online games can be played by yourself, there's a socialization that happens. Of course, you're interacting with other people over the internet, but it is an activity you can do by yourself, in the comfort of your own home. And of course, the computer has become this window into a whole nother world of social activity that we're only really just beginning to understand, and how that's going to be affecting people. But so is the obsession with Facebook and and so on and so forth. I mean, that can be certainly
an addiction in itself.
An addiction, yeah. And so, I've always said to people, because there are a lot of people who are concerned, parents and educators, they want to know because they don't understand what these things are. And, like any parent, I think the thing is just to, be aware of what your kid is doing and don't let him or her do one activity to the exclusion of everything else. Like, you got to get outside, run around in the woods, and, do some other activities. And I think 99% of the people out there are pretty aware of that.
Yes, and me, I think that like you said, the video games today they're more addictive because like with the D&Ds, the ones that you and I played back then, the Star Trek role playing game that I played, you had to play it with other people there in front of you. You couldn't do it online because we didn't have internet. So there was a social aspect to it. Nowadays, like you just said, you can be literally in your dorm room or in a basement somewhere just by yourself, and you can be immersed in that world for hours and hours and hours. Yeah,
and I think there is something that we are missing. And, as an old school gamer, when I went into the research phase for my book, which really involved, me jumping into a lot of these subcultures that I'd never experienced and certainly hadn't experienced in 25 years. I kind of had a prejudice, which is basically, these old tabletop, pencil and paper games are going to be better, and then the new games, World of Warcraft, whatever. It was an unfair characterization, but I was a little bit skeptical, and I was really surprised to learn that, of course, there are some not so happy endings to some people's relationship to gaming, but there's so many wonderful positive stories out there too, of people who found a sense of purpose and community and have really, in a way, used gaming as an outlet to express things that they couldn't express in the real world, and then, after they've played some of these games, or let's say participated in live-action role-playing LARPing, they, in many cases, feel a little more prepared to face the real world because they are learn to be a little more aggressive, to be a little bit more risk-taking, and in many cases, the kinds of skills you learn in those gaming environments you can apply to the real world. So there's all kinds of ways in which the media can glom onto the negative stories, and I really tried in my book to really focus on the positive ones, because I think that's the untold story.
Right, and speaking of the real world, sometimes it does get in the way. For example, with me, I've been doing this radio thing for a while, and when I got a little bit of success in it, I had to play the cool DJ on the air, and I couldn't exactly talk about my Star Trek role-playing days and all those things. And the same thing kind of happened to you. You kind of got away from it, right? So tell me about that point in your life.
Well, I really, I think, to a certain extent, felt like I had exhausted at least what D&D was going to do for me. It was a kind of a turning point. I do remember this very, very vividly. I was a senior in high school, and I finally had my first girlfriend. I mean, this is sort of how kind of slow to develop I was. Like, the first time I ever kissed a girl was my senior year in high school. And I thought, well, okay, things are changing, and gosh, these real girlfriends are a lot more fun than the imaginary ones that I've been looking at in all the different D&D rule books and so forth. So I went away to college, kind of thinking, here's a chance for me to, come out of my shell a little bit more, and like you were saying, maybe put some of this stuff behind me. And I had really had a negative association with a lot of the gaming. And much of it had to do with, honestly, my relationship to my mom and what had happened at home. And here I was breaking out, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go to this liberal arts college, and I'm going to become a filmmaker or a writer, and I'm going to learn how to drink beer and get a girlfriend and just kind of, go the mainstream, more mainstream way, but, really forge a new identity for myself. And I think it was an unfortunate. In many ways, it was a good thing for me to, to move on and do other things. But I think in the process, what was lost was what I really loved about gaming, which was this imaginative place that you get to go to. It's such a creative venue for, interaction and solving problems in creative ways. So I really credit a lot of what I learned in D&D and reading, let's say, Tolkien, with a kind of a mindset that I've been able to use in other creative endeavors as a writer, as a one-time filmmaker. If you can create a world as a dungeon master in D&D, then you're pretty well set to be a novelist, in some ways.
Yeah.
To be a scriptwriter, or any number of things. So.
Geek Speak Radio Show will be right back.